It began in silence, the kind of silence that presses against your chest and makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. An old iron door. A dimly lit hallway. 15 neighbors standing still, wide-eyed, ears strained toward the apartment where the screams were coming from. They weren't just any screams, they were desperate, raw, pleading. The kind that don't just echo, they haunt. For over 6 long hours, the building bore witness to the collapse of humanity on the other side of that door. A young woman, just 22, was inside. Her name was Vera Pectova. Bright, ambitious, and kind-hearted, she had her whole life ahead of her. But that night, she wasn't a future economist, or a daughter, or a friend. She was a voice behind metal, a voice begging for help while the people meant to protect her stayed quiet. 7 times, the neighbors dialed for help. 7 times, they pleaded with the police. And 7 times, nothing happened. The police office sat just minutes away. Officers moved through their shifts with mechanical ease, sipping tea and chatting casually as the calls came in. No one rushed. No one acted. If anything, the panicked voices on the other end of the line seemed to annoy them more than concern them. As if they were being bothered by a dying girl's screams. There's a strange kind of horror in knowing that a tragedy was not only preventable but witnessed. That's the chilling truth of Vera Pectova's story. She wasn't hidden. She wasn't isolated. She was heard loud and clear, and still, help never came. It's not just a tale of violence. It's not just the story of a young woman betrayed by someone she once trusted. It's the story of a system that chose indifference. A story that would shock an entire nation and ignite a firestorm of outrage. And it all started with a door, one that stayed shut for far too long. Vera Pectova had the kind of presence that left a gentle imprint on everyone she met, quiet yet confident, soft-spoken but impossible to ignore. She had that spark, the one people notice even in a crowd. She was only 22 years old, living in the modest town of Karovo, Russia, but her dreams stretched far beyond the boundaries of its gray buildings and narrow streets. Her eyes held a curious mix of youth and depth, like someone who had lived through enough to understand life's sharp edges, yet still believed she could file them down. From a young age, Vera stood out not for being loud or attention-seeking, but for her thoughtfulness. She could draw, paint, sing with a voice that shimmered in school halls during talent shows. Teachers praised her not just for her creativity, but for her critical thinking. Her classmates called her the girl with a plan. But what nobody saw coming was how that plan would begin to unravel, quietly and fatally, under the illusion of love. Her home life was complex. Her parents divorced when she was young, a break that might have shaken a less grounded child. But Vera adapted. She nurtured relationships with both parents, even accepting their new partners with surprising maturity. Still, her heart belonged to her mother, Oksana. They weren't just mother and daughter, they were confidants. They shared everything. Hopes, doubts, dreams, and eventually, secrets. This closeness meant that Oksana would become the first and perhaps only person to sense the darkness creeping into Vera's life. Vera didn't choose the obvious path. With all her artistic talents, many thought she'd pursue music or fine arts. Instead, she enrolled in university to study economic security. It was a choice that surprised even her friends. But for Vera, it made perfect sense. She wanted to fight corruption, to help clean up the murky institutions that held her country back. It wasn't just ambition, it was conviction. She believed in justice. Ironically, it would be justice that failed her when she needed it most. In 2016, during a casual evening gathering, Vera crossed paths with someone from her past, Vladislav Kus. He was a familiar face, a boy she vaguely remembered from school. There was nothing remarkable about him then, he had floated under the radar, quiet, almost ghost-like. But that night, he was different. Confident. Maybe too confident. And Vera, still so young, still believing in redemption stories, let him in. What started as innocent reconnection quickly became something more. It was that intoxicating beginning, the kind filled with late-night conversations, long walks, shared dreams. But beneath Vlad's charm was a void, something brittle and volatile. He had a haunted look in his eyes that Vera mistook for depth. She thought she saw a man who had been through hell but was still standing. She didn't realize she was looking into the eyes of someone who had never left hell behind at all. In the weeks that followed, the two became inseparable. Pictures began to appear on social media, holding hands in a cafe, laughing under street lamps, a selfie with matching smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes. People around her didn't see a love story, they saw warning signs. But Vera? She saw potential. She saw someone broken who just needed to be loved right. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing a person can have is hope. Vladislav Kus was not the kind of man most people would bring home. There was something about him that made people uneasy, even when he smiled. Maybe it was the way he spoke, too quiet, too measured. Or the way he seemed to drift through spaces like he wasn't really part of them. He had a history, one stitched together with shadows, abandonment, run-ins with the law, and a tragedy too dark for a boy to carry. When Vlad was just a child, his mother walked out of his life without explanation. She didn't say goodbye, didn't leave a note, just vanished. That alone might have been enough to unravel a mind still trying to understand the world. But fate wasn't done with him. His father, a volatile man with a growing rap sheet and an even shorter fuse, spiraled further out of control. And then came the moment that would mark Vlad forever. He watched as his father took his own life with a hunting rifle. It wasn't something he talked about. He didn't need to. You could see it in his eyes. From that moment on, Vlad unraveled. School no longer mattered, he dropped out in 9th grade. Work was never an option. Instead, he chose the bottle, seeking comfort in alcohol and trouble. Small thefts turned into bigger ones. His record grew, and so did his reputation. People described him as angry, volatile, cold. But Vera didn't see what they saw. She saw the cracks in him and mistook them for doorways. She believed, with the stubbornness only the young possess, that love could fix what life had broken. That if she just loved him enough, was patient enough, kind enough, she could reach the small part of him that wanted to be good. That's the thing about people like Vera, they believe in light even when all they're standing in is darkness. Her parents weren't fooled. Her father begged her to leave him. Her mother, Oksana, was more measured but just as worried. She noticed how Vlad never contributed, how he relied on Vera for everything from money to emotional support. Friends pulled her aside at parties, messaged her late at night, whispering truths she didn't want to hear. He's using you. He's dangerous. Get out. But Vera clung to the idea that she was helping him. She defended him, deflected their concerns, and even started hiding the worst parts of their relationship. The smiling pictures stopped. The family visits ended. The once vivid life she shared so openly began to shrink, piece by piece, behind closed doors. In early 2019, Vera made a decision she would come to regret. She let Vlad move in with her. It was meant to be a new chapter, but from the start, it read more like a warning. He didn't work. He didn't study. He drank all day and picked fights when he was sober enough to speak. The man who once made her laugh now broke things when he was angry. And worse, he began to isolate her. It started subtly, disapproving glances when she took a phone call. Then came the demands: don't talk to this person. Don't go there. Don't dress like that. Soon, Vera wasn't just walking on eggshells, she was building a life out of them. And all the while, she kept believing that if she just loved him harder, this nightmare would turn back into the dream it had promised to be. But the dream was long gone. By November 2019, the violence she had kept hidden crossed a line. Vlad laid hands on her. The arguments were no longer just words. The bruises, though carefully hidden, were real. That was when something inside Vera cracked, not like him, with rage but with quiet resolve. She finally left. Packed a bag. Walked away. It should have ended there. But Vlad. He didn't see it as an ending. He saw it as a challenge. And monsters, when cornered, don't disappear. They wait. They plan. And sometimes they come back meaner. By the time January rolled around, Vera had been doing her best to rebuild. She had moved into a student dorm, returned to her studies, and kept herself busy with university life. From the outside, it seemed like she was finally stepping out from under the shadow that had loomed over her for so long. But anyone who's ever tried to escape someone like Vlad knows, it's not always the moment you leave that's dangerous, it's the moment they realize they've lost control. That moment came on January 12, 2020. The call wasn't alarming. If anything, it felt like progress. Vlad had called her unexpectedly and said he was ready to let go. He told her she could come and pick up the rest of her belongings from the apartment. He even sounded calm. Cooperative. She had a test the next morning, and this seemed like a quick task, just grab her things and be done with him for good. That was all she wanted. Closure. A clean cut. At 5:08 p.m., Vera sent a message to her friend. She said she'd be done packing in 30 minutes. She planned to take a taxi back to her dorm and meet up by 6. It was the kind of text that doesn't feel final until it's the last one. But then, the tone changed. Just minutes later, another message came through. This one wasn't typed quickly, casually. It was short. Whispered. Her voice was low, her words clipped like someone trying not to be heard. There was tension wrapped around every syllable. Her friend, sensing something was off, messaged back. But there was no reply. Then came another message, odd, forced, as though someone else might have been watching. And then, silence. That kind of silence that makes your stomach twist. The kind that feels like the breath before a scream. Inside the apartment, something was happening. We will never know exactly when the shift occurred, when Vlad decided that this wasn't about closure after all. But what followed was a psychological descent so dark, it shook an entire building. Neighbors, used to the ordinary creaks and muffled television sounds of apartment life, began to hear something else shouting. Then yelling. Then something unmistakably more frantic. A woman's voice, sharp with panic. At first, people weren't sure. Maybe it was a fight. Maybe someone needed help. But soon, there was no doubt. The cries were coming fast now. They weren't just scared, they were pleading. One neighbor pressed their ear to the door. Another walked out into the hallway and paused. Then another. Soon, a quiet crowd began to gather outside Vera's apartment, listening in disbelief to what was unfolding inside. What no one knew, what none of them could possibly know, was that Vlad had never intended to let her leave. The call, the calm tone, the suggestion to come pick up her things, it had all been bait. A trap designed by a man who couldn't stand to be abandoned. Vera had walked right into it. Alone. Her friend, who had expected her by 6, began to worry. Calls went unanswered. Messages were left unread. The clock kept ticking. Inside that apartment, Vera was now locked in a struggle, not just for her belongings but for her life. The clock struck 9, and the building in Karovo should have been quiet. Neighbors finishing dinner, children fast asleep, televisions murmuring behind thin walls. But that night, the air was thick with something else. A scream pierced the silence, sharp, sudden, chilling. It wasn't the kind of scream that made you curious. It was the kind that made your blood run cold. Vera Pectova was crying out for help. Not once. Not twice. But over and over again. Her voice cracked with terror, with agony, with the unmistakable sound of someone who knew they were running out of time. Behind that heavy iron door, something horrifying was happening. And the building, it heard everything. It started small. A neighbor in the next apartment turned down their TV, frowning. Another muted their music. They heard yelling. A crash. Then sobbing. Then the screams began. People stepped into the hallway, unsure of what they were hearing, hoping, perhaps, that they'd misunderstood. But there was no mistaking it. Vera was begging. Pleading. Screaming like her life depended on it. Because it did. Someone called the police. Then another. Then another. In total, there were 7 calls made to emergency services that night. The first one was almost calm-concerned, but hopeful. The caller said a woman was screaming for help. Could someone come check? The dispatcher said they'd look into it. They didn't. As the minutes crawled by, the screams grew more desperate. Vera's voice echoed through the hall, sometimes loud, sometimes faint, sometimes sobbed in broken Russian between gasps. At one point, she reached the door. Witnesses would later say they heard her fists pounding against the metal, her voice high and shaking, crying for someone, anyone, to let her out. But Vlad was never going to let her go. He dragged her back inside. And the nightmare continued. Outside, neighbors were frantic. Some tried banging on the door. Others screamed back, begging Vlad to stop. Still others grabbed their phones and called the police again. She's being hurt, one man said. She's screaming. She's begging for help. Please do something. The dispatcher gave the same response, we have no available cars. We'll send someone soon. But no one came. Minutes turned into hours. At one point, Vlad's brother, Stanislav, arrived. Something about their conversation earlier had unsettled him. He couldn't explain it, just a feeling. He found the crowd in the hallway, listened to the chaos behind the door, and froze. His brother was inside. Vera was inside. And there was nothing he could do. Vlad, drunk and driven by something darker than rage, had turned the apartment into a cage. Vera's cries were punctuated by the dull thuds of violence. The sound of breaking. The sound of suffering. No one knows exactly how long she endured. Some say she tried to reason with him. Some say she screamed his name. Some say she went quiet and then started again, like waves of pain crashing again and again until there was nothing left to scream. By 2 a.m., the crowd outside had grown. People were barefoot, half-dressed, wrapped in coats and blankets, trying desperately to think of a way in. Someone had run out to a nearby lot and found a rusted crowbar. They took turns ramming it into the doorframe, trying to break the lock, trying to do what the authorities would not. And still, from inside, they could hear Vera. They heard the moment her voice cracked from too much screaming. They heard her stumble and fall. They heard Vlad, his voice low, sometimes whispering, sometimes snarling. Vera, forgive me, he said at one point. A neighbor heard it clearly. I love you. Then came one last sound. A dull, final thud. Then, silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind. It was heavy. Crushing. Unnatural. The kind of silence that fills a hallway with dread. When they finally got the door open, it was too late. Vera's body was there. Still. Broken. The apartment was a scene of unimaginable cruelty. Blood stained the walls, the ceiling, the floors. Vlad was found in the bathroom, passed out, the kitchen knife still in his hand. It was almost 7 a.m. when the final call to police was made. The dispatcher asked what had happened. The neighbor's voice cracked as she answered, "She's gone." When the door was finally broken down and the chaos gave way to devastation, those who stepped inside Vera's apartment weren't met with confusion, they were met with certainty. What they saw, what they smelled, what they felt in their bones, left no room for doubt. Something unforgivable had happened there. But what made it even more unbearable was the fact that it didn't have to. Vera Pectova didn't die in the shadows. She didn't disappear quietly. She died in full earshot of dozens of witnesses. She died while people screamed into phone receivers, begging trained professionals to come and do their jobs. She died while a system made excuses. In the hours and days that followed, the truth that began to emerge wasn't just disturbing, it was infuriating. Recordings of emergency calls surfaced. The voices of neighbors trembling, panicked, desperate were played back during the investigation. And alongside those calls, surveillance footage from the police station. Officers sipping tea, laughing, filing paperwork. One even took a nap. While Vera screamed. When questioned, the officials gave excuses that seemed plucked from fiction. No patrol cars available, they said. No fuel in the tank, another claimed. But later, it was discovered that not only were their cars available, they were sent elsewhere. To less urgent calls. One officer had prioritized a wellness check on an elderly man who had already passed away. Another had simply shifted responsibility to the next person as their shift ended. There was no sense of urgency. No protocol that kicked in. No empathy. And certainly no accountability. When forensic teams processed the crime scene, they counted 56 separate injuries on Vera's body. 56. Deep cuts. Blunt force trauma. Internal bleeding. Bruises that mapped out the hours of torture she endured. Her face was so severely disfigured that the workers at the funeral home labored for hours just to make her recognizable again. Her mother, Oksana, later said she would have never known it was her daughter if they hadn't told her. And still, despite the overwhelming evidence that the system failed at every single level, no one lost their job. In court, 3 emergency responders were formally charged not for negligence, but for failure to perform duties. A phrase so sterile, so clinical, it stripped the situation of any human weight. The sentences handed down? Suspended. 1.5 years. 2 years. They didn't serve a single day behind bars. They walked out of that courtroom free. They walked back into their jobs. They walked back into society like nothing had happened. The compensation ordered to be paid to Vera's grieving family was laughable, $369 per person. As if a few $100s could erase the 6 hours of terror, the silence on the other end of the phone, the horror Vera lived through minute by minute while help sat idling just blocks away. In a different place, this case might have sparked reform. In a different world, there would have been resignations, policy changes, public apologies. But in Russia, Vera's story became a cautionary tale not just about violence but about invisibility. About what happens when a government and its institutions see women not as citizens in danger, but as nuisances to be silenced. Background noise. It wasn't just Vlad who killed Vera. It was the dispatcher who rolled her eyes when the 5th call came in. It was the officer who looked at the log and decided it can wait. It was the supervisor who chose to do nothing. It was the entire chain of command that had every chance to save her but instead chose stillness. Chose indifference. Chose silence. Justice came quietly. Too quietly. When Vladislav Kus stood before the court, there was no real display of remorse, no visible crack in his carefully constructed mask. He didn't cry. He didn't beg. He explained, he minimized, he deflected. He spoke of losing control, of not meaning to, as if Vera had tripped and fallen into her own death. The court sentenced him to 17 years in prison. On paper, it sounded like justice, nearly 2 decades for a crime so brutal it haunted not just a family, but a nation. But in Russia, paper justice rarely translates to real justice. And for Vera's mother, Oksana, that became all too clear just 6 months later. It began as a rumor. A whisper on a forum. A comment thread that exploded overnight. Then a photo surfaced. Vlad not in prison fatigues, not behind bars but in military uniform. Rifle slung over his shoulder. Smile faint. Eyes hollow. He had been released. Not pardoned, not acquitted, released. His 17-year sentence had dissolved into 6 months of custody and a one-way ticket to the front lines in Ukraine. Under a wartime decree, Russia had begun quietly recruiting inmates for combat, offering early release in exchange for military service. Murderers, thieves, traffickers turned into soldiers overnight. And among them was Vlad, the man who had taken Vera's life in the most violent, drawn-out way imaginable. A man who had ignored every plea for mercy, and still walked free. When Oksana saw the image, her breath caught. This wasn't theoretical anymore. Her daughter's killer was out in the world armed, trained, and unmonitored. He wasn't serving a sentence. He was serving in a war. And then, even that didn't last. After just a few months, Vlad was gone from the battlefield. His name no longer on any military rolls. His location? Unknown. Oksana, the woman who had buried her only child, now lived in fear not just of what had happened, but of what could happen. What if he came back? What if he came for her? What if the same system that refused to help Vera once, refused again? This wasn't just her fear. It was the collective dread of women across the country who saw their reflection in Vera's story. Because in Russia, domestic violence is not always seen as a crime. It's a family matter, a private issue. In 2017, lawmakers decriminalized first-time domestic abuse so long as it didn't cause serious physical injury. If your abuser left you bruised but breathing, it was a fine. A warning. A slap on the wrist. Vera's case shattered the illusion that family violence is somehow less dangerous than the stranger in a dark alley. She died screaming for help. Surrounded by witnesses. On record. On tape. With receipts and evidence and bloodstains. And still, the system decided her life could be bartered for boots on the ground. There was no reform. No sweeping change. Just a brief flicker of outrage, drowned out by the daily churn of politics and propaganda. The people who ignored her cries went back to their jobs. The laws that failed her remain intact. And Vlad? He vanished into the machinery, free to start over. Vera didn't get a second chance. She didn't get to grow older, to fight corruption, to become the woman she dreamed of being. But her killer got a new identity. A weapon. And a way out. Oksana now sleeps with lights on. She locks her doors 3 times. She keeps curtains closed, even during the day. Because when justice is treated like a commodity, something to trade for war or silence, the real sentence is served by the survivors. The funeral took place on a gray morning in Karovo. The air was still, heavy with the kind of silence that usually follows after something terrible has happened. Word of Vera's death had spread far beyond the apartment building where it happened, far beyond her university, her hometown, her country even. Her story had slipped through the cracks of indifference and exploded across headlines, timelines, and message boards. She was no longer just a young woman who died a violent death. She had become something else. A symbol. A spark. Over 1,000 people came to say goodbye. Some were family. Some were classmates. Some were strangers who only knew her from a photograph or a headline. They came with candles, with flowers, with handwritten notes. They lined up in long rows outside the church, shoulders touching, faces blurred with tears and disbelief. Inside the church, Vera's body lay still, but it was not the Vera her loved ones remembered. Her face had been so disfigured by the attack that a team of funeral workers spent hours painstakingly restoring it, just enough for her mother to recognize her. Oksana later admitted that she wouldn't have known it was her daughter if someone hadn't told her. And even then, she wasn't sure. But what made the air electric that day wasn't just the grief, it was the rage beneath it. There was no peace to be found in Vera's death. No comfort in closure. Only a painful, public reminder that in Russia and in many parts of the world women's lives are often seen as negotiable, disposable, easier to ignore than to protect. But Vera's story refused to be buried with her. Activists began speaking out louder than ever. Domestic violence, long dismissed as a private matter or a cultural norm, was dragged into the public square and interrogated under the harsh light of reality. No longer was it just about Vera. It was about all the women who had called for help and were told, "There's nothing we can do." About all the daughters, mothers, sisters who had been turned into headlines, briefly mourned, and then forgotten. Vera became a rallying cry. A name people painted on protest signs. A face printed on banners. A story passed from one person to the next like a torch. Her mother, Oksana, found herself in the center of it all, grieving, yes, but also fighting. She spoke to journalists. She joined hands with survivors. She stared into cameras and told the world, "My daughter died because no one listened. Don't let her be just another name." Across the country, candlelight vigils began to appear. Groups of women, men, and children gathered in public squares and on street corners, holding portraits of Vera. Some carried signs that read, "She called." They didn't come. Others read, "Silence is complicity." And slowly, something started to shift. Not in the laws, those remained stubborn, slow, resistant, but in the people. Conversations that had once been whispered in kitchens were now shouted in the streets. Survivors came forward. Journalists dug deeper. International human rights groups took notice. Vera didn't live to see that change. But she became its heartbeat. It's a bitter truth that sometimes it takes a tragedy to wake a nation. That sometimes a single scream has to echo into nothing before people realize the silence must be broken. But Vera's story did what the laws couldn't. It moved people. It shook them. It forced them to confront a reality too many were too comfortable ignoring. And while her life was taken far too soon, her voice didn't die in that apartment. It lives in the rallies. In the petitions. In every woman who steps forward and says, "No more." Because when the system chose not to protect Vera, people did. And they're still choosing her. Every day. This wasn't just one woman's tragedy. It wasn't an isolated event, or a freak occurrence. What happened to Vera Pectova is part of a pattern, a crack in the system wide enough to swallow lives whole. She didn't die in silence. She screamed. She pleaded. She called out, again and again, and the world chose not to listen. That's what makes this story so devastating. Not just the violence, but the indifference that let it happen. Vera's name will never be just a headline, not to those who stood outside her door, too late to save her. Not to her mother, who still wakes up at night wondering if there was more she could have done. Not to the people who held candles at her funeral, chanting her name until their voices went hoarse. And not to you now that you know. Because once you know what happened, you can't unknow it. You can't unhear her screams. You can't unread the reports. You can't erase the image of a broken door, a broken girl, and a system that never opened fast enough to let her live. But you can choose what to do next. You can talk about Vera not just as a victim, but as a warning. As a signal flare in a world too used to ignoring the people who need help most. You can refuse to look away. You can share her story. You can ask why her killer walks free, why her death was bartered for war, and why emergency responders still wear badges after ignoring 7 calls for help. You can speak up. Loudly. Relentlessly. Because silence isn't just complicity. It's deadly. We owe it to Vera and to every voice like hers that was silenced to make sure what happened behind that door isn't forgotten. That her story doesn't become just another name on a list. That we don't just move on, scroll past, and bury it beneath the next headline. This isn't the end of Vera's story. It's the beginning of what you choose to do with it. Say her name. Share her truth. Break the silence. In memory of Vera Pectova. 1997 to 2020.